is the doctor's notes, usually like from the visit, and we're looking for a main term. We want to find the main term that is the diagnosis. And this is where a good understanding of medical terminology comes into play. You really want to know the language that the doctors speak, because it's going to help you tremendously when coding a diagnosis. And what I recommend is there's a lot of good medical terminology dictionaries and whatnot. Of course, you can always Google stuff, but I would have whatever your source is for medical terminology, have that close by when you're coding. That way you just have easy access, and it'll give you such a better idea of where to start to look for a code sometimes. So now that we've figured out what the main term is, we want to take that main term and go to the index of diseases and injuries. And you're going to look up the main term there. And keep in mind, the main term is the illness or disease or condition that the patient is being seen for. So you look it up, and a lot of times there's going to be subcategories within there. So there may be acute or chronic, and you want to take all this stuff into consideration because it's extremely important that you code to the most specific code possible. It's a very big deal that when you're choosing a code, a lot of times, it could be this one, it could be this one, but this one really describes it. And so we want to make sure that you're coding to the highest specificity. The other thing is sometimes you're going to look up a code and it may not be exactly like what you saw in the notes. And this is where the medical terminology, it's really going to come in handy. So let me give you an example of one that would be like that. Let's take, for instance, you're reading through the medical record and the doctor writes right hip pain. That's the diagnosis, right hip pain. And so we know to look up pain as the main term. And so we go to the index of diseases and injuries, and we go to pain. And now once you found pain, you look down, and there's a lot of other choices there. There's a lot of subcategories, and there's not one for hip. You don't see hip on there anywhere. But what is on there is joint. And that's where you got to be able to put two and two together and realize that even though the doctor may have wrote right hip pain, which is what it is, when we're coding it, that's going to be joint pain. So now we know the basics of looking up a code. We're going to start in the index to diseases and injuries, use our main term to then look up what the specific word is for the condition or the disease. And once we find that, we're going to check for parentheses, any notes under there, any see alsos, or any just kind of guidance that it's giving us there. Then we're going to go check it in the tabular list. And once we look in the tabular list, we find the details, and we're able to assign the correct code. So sometimes though, you'll come across different diagnoses that are kind of hard to find or not listed like you would think they would be listed. A lot of it's just trying to figure out what is the main term. What is it they're really trying to get me to look for? So, for instance, let's look at COPD. So say you're coding and you come across the medical record from the doctor and his diagnosis is COPD. You go, use COPD as your main term, look it up, there's nothing there. There's nothing in the index that says COPD. So there's a couple things you can do here. One, this is a good instance, like I was saying, when it's really good to know your medical terminology. Because if you know your medical terminology, you know that COPD means chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Or if you had really easy reference to a medical dictionary, you could find that really easily. So when you're looking it up, you can look it up two different ways. First, you could go by obstruction. What is the underlying issue? Ultimately, the underlying issue is obstruction of the lung. And so reading it backwards sometimes helps as well. Instead of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, read it backwards and you see disease pulmonary obstructive chronic. And in that case, that's the second way you're going to look it up. Because if you look up the disease of pulmonary, you go to pulmonary, look up pulmonary. Under that, you'll be able to find lung obstruction chronic. So see, sometimes we got to get creative about the way that we're looking for it, but at the end of the day, we have to find out what that main term is, look it up in the index, and then take that word that we found in the index and go to the tabular list and look for any last instructions before assigning the code. Alright, let's talk about signs and symptoms. In the outpatient setting, you cannot code a diagnosis unless it's definitive. So ways that you'll know if it's a definitive diagnosis or not is when you're reading the doctor's notes, if he says things like probable or suspected, can't be ruled out, stuff like that makes it not a definitive diagnosis. And so if it's not a definitive diagnosis, the next thing you have to do is go to the signs and symptoms. And so you're going to code any symptoms that you see throughout the doctor's note, not the diagnosis. Now, when you're coding signs and symptoms, and let's say there's a diagnosis and the doctor coded, a specific diagnosis, and then there's signs and symptoms coded as well. If these signs and symptoms are an integral part of the disease, then you do not code the signs and symptoms. If it's not an integral part of that original diagnosis, then you can code those signs and symptoms. So let me make that a little bit more clear. So let's say the doctor has a patient and the diagnosis is, let's say, sinusitis. And they also put runny nose as a diagnosis. Well, in this case, we would not code the runny nose because that is an integral part of the sinusitis. Another case could be, let's say that a patient is being seen for asthma, and the doctor also has another code for right shoulder pain. And so that symptom, that sign or symptom of right shoulder pain is not related to the asthma in any way. And so in that case, a sign and a symptom can be coded with the definitive principal diagnosis. Next, let's talk about combination codes. Combination codes are when two codes are basically combined into one. This happens when there's some type of similarity, or the first code has a manifestation that causes the second code. And so an instance of this would be, let's say somebody was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes mellitus as well as diabetic dermatitis. Now, each of these diagnoses have their own code, but they also have a combination code, which if you look at E11.620, you'll see the combination of type 2 diabetic with dermatitis. Sequelas are the residual effect or the condition produced after the acute phase of an illness has passed. So you'll see keywords like previous illness or from a previous injury, and when you see this, you know that these are sequela. This is a sequela, late effects. And when you look it up in the index to diseases and injuries, you're going to look up under the word sequela as the condition. And so when you have a sequela code, it's usually going to be two codes. The first principal code, which is going to be the cause of the sequela, and then the second code, which is the effect, which is the sequela code. And these codes would be like, an example would be if somebody got arthritis after a wrist injury. Now they have arthritis in the wrist. That arthritis is sequela to the original wrist injury. Reporting the same diagnosis code more than once. Do not do it. Do not report the same diagnosis code more than once. Sometimes the doctor may put the same diagnosis for two different conditions, like separate conditions, but it's the same diagnosis. Just use that code, that unique code, one time. Another instance is sometimes if it's like a bilateral thing, where it's, you know, two legs or whatever, again, don't report it twice. What we do with laterality is, so laterality, we have a code can be, let's just take for instance a broken bone. The code can be right, let's say a broken arm. It can be right, left, or it can be bilateral. And each code will have a different number, and what changes it is the very last number in the code is what determines left, right, or bilateral. So sometimes you'll come across some cases where the doctor doesn't tell you. He forgets to list it. He doesn't list left, right, or bilateral. In those cases, we go to our not otherwise specified, NOS. And then in other cases, you'll have where, let's say the patient broke his right femur and his left femur. Well, the doctor has put down the codes for broken right femur, broken left femur. Well, there's a bilateral code that says broken femurs. You use the bilateral code. Now, there are other instances, don't let me lose you here, there are other instances where, let's say, they broke their left foot and they broke their right foot, but there's not a bilateral code for broken left and right foot. So in this case, you would code broken right foot and broken left foot separately. That's going to wrap up this chapter on coding basics. Stay focused, go after your dreams, and keep working towards your goals.